The land held its breath in the heat of 1887. It was a place of baked earth and skeletal trees, where the sun was a hammer and the sky was a vast, unforgiving blue. For a man like Garrett Weston, it was both a sanctuary and a prison. He'd been riding for 3 days straight, the ghost of a posse at his back, and the heavier weight of his own past strapped to his saddle, a past he could never unfurl. His water was low, a warm metallic swill at the bottom of his canteen, and his horse, Dust, was starting to falter. Garrett was a man pared down to essentials: leather, dust, and a bone-deep weariness. His face was a map of hard miles, his eyes the color of a faded sky, constantly scanning the horizon. He was an outlaw, a name whispered in saloons and printed on wanted posters. The price on his head was enough to make a poor man rich and a greedy man reckless. But the man on that poster felt like a stranger, a fiction created by one desperate act years ago. The man in the saddle was just tired. So damn tired. He found the seep spring tucked into a crease of rock, hidden by a scraggly clutch of cottonwoods. It was a miracle in this desolation. It was less a spring and more a damp stain on the rock, weeping just enough water to fill a canteen over an hour. As Dust drank gratefully, Garrett knelt, splashing the precious cool liquid onto his face. For the first time in a day, the knot of tension in his shoulders eased. He'd rest here for the night, in the cover of the rocks, and move on before dawn. It was his routine, the monotonous rhythm of survival. He was so focused on the water, on the blessed silence, that he didn't hear her approach. It was a shift in the air, a presence where there should have been none, that made him look up. His hand instinctively dropped to the Colt holstered at his hip. She was standing not 10 feet away, a small, still figure against the deepening twilight. A little girl, no older than 7 or 8. Her hair was the color of sun-bleached corn, and her dress, once blue, was now the color of the dust she stood upon. She wasn't crying, she wasn't frightened, she just watched him with eyes that were startlingly clear and serious. Old eyes in a young face. Garrett's heart hammered against his ribs. A child out here? Alone? It was wrong, a violation of the natural order of this brutal place. His first thought was a trap, a posse using a kid as bait. He'd heard of such things. Cruel, but effective. He slowly rose to his feet, his body a tight coil of suspicion. "You alone, girl?" he asked, his voice a rough rasp from disuse. She nodded, a single solemn dip of her chin. Her gaze never wavered from his face. Then she took a small step forward, her bare feet making no sound on the packed earth. "Mister," she began, her voice small but clear, carrying in the immense quiet, "can you say a prayer for my ma?" The question hit Garrett like a physical blow. It was so absurd, so profoundly out of place, that he could only stare. A prayer? From him? A man who hadn't spoken to God in a decade, and even then, it had been a curse. He swallowed, the motion dry in his throat. "What's that you say?" he asked, feeling foolish. "A prayer," she repeated, as if he were a little slow. She pointed with a thin, dusty arm towards a hulking shadow he hadn't noticed before, a shape half hidden by a rocky outcrop 100 yards away. "She's dying over yonder." Garrett's mind raced. This changed nothing. It was still a trap, or a problem so deep he would surely drown in it. The code of the wild was simple. You look after your own hide. You don't take on burdens. Burdens got you caught, or got you killed. He should have mounted Dust and ridden away, fast and far, leaving the girl and her dying mother to whatever fate awaited them. It was the smart thing to do. It was the only thing to do. But he didn't move. He stood frozen, held fast by the unwavering gravity of the little girl's gaze. He saw no cunning there, no deceit. He saw only a desperate, simple plea. A plea that felt dangerously familiar. "Why me?" he finally managed to ask. "'Cause you're here," she said, with the irrefutable logic of a child. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, a long, weary sigh. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, but a different part of him, a part he thought long dead and buried, stirred. "All right, girl," he heard himself say, his own voice sounding foreign. "Show me." Her name was Cora, and her mother was Hannah. He learned this as he followed her, keeping a cautious distance, his eyes scanning the surrounding rocks for any sign of movement. The wagon was worse than he'd imagined. It was a wreck. One wheel was shattered, the axle splintered. The canvas was torn, flapping in the slight evening breeze like a wounded bird. It looked as if it hadn't just broken down, it looked like it had been run off a cliff. Inside, on a makeshift bed of dirty quilts, a woman lay still. In the dim light filtering through the ripped canvas, Garrett could see a face pale as milk glass, damp with fever. Her breathing was a shallow, rattling sound. It was a sound he knew all too well. Consumption, or a fever that had settled deep. Either way, it was a death sentence out here. Cora went to her mother's side, taking a thin, limp hand in her own. "Ma," she whispered, "I brought someone. A mister. He's going to help." The woman's eyes fluttered open. They were hazy with sickness, unfocused. They drifted past Cora and landed on Garrett, who stood awkwardly at the back of the wagon, his hat in his hands. He felt like a hulking, graceless intruder. "Henry," the woman whispered, her voice a fragile thread, "you came back." Garrett said nothing. Henry must have been the husband, Cora's father. Dead, most likely. It would explain their desperate situation. But then Cora did something strange. Her little body tensed. "His name ain't Henry, Ma," she said, her voice tight. "He's just a mister." Hannah's eyes tried to focus on him again. A glimmer of confusion warred with the fog of her illness. And then Garrett saw it. A flicker of pure, undiluted fear. It wasn't the fear of a stranger. It was the fear of a specific man. She saw something in his face, in his posture, that terrified her. Was it just the fever, or was it something else? Before he could process it, her eyes rolled back and she began to mutter, words he couldn't understand, a frantic, jumbled prayer. He took a half step back out of the wagon. "I'll get some water," he muttered, turning away, the woman's fearful gaze burning into his back. This was more than just a broken-down family. Something was very wrong here. He worked with a grim efficiency, filling his canteen and a dented bucket he found in the wagon, then gathering wood for a fire. As the sun set, the desert chill seeped into the air. He built the fire a short distance from the wagon, offering warmth without intrusion. Cora came and sat on a rock nearby, watching him. She didn't speak, but her presence was a constant, quiet question. Why was he helping? He asked himself the same thing. He just knew that the thought of riding away, of leaving this child to watch her mother die alone, was a line even he could not cross. He had a little jerky and some hardtack in his saddlebags. Not food for a sick woman. He took his rifle. "Stay by the fire," he told the girl. "Don't you wander." She nodded, her small face illuminated by the flickering flames. "You coming back?" she asked, her voice small. "I'm coming back," he said, and the promise settled in his chest with an unfamiliar weight. An hour later, he returned with a rabbit. He skinned and cleaned it with practiced motions, his mind blessedly empty, focused only on the task. He boiled the meat in the dented bucket, making a thin broth. It was something, an action, and action was better than the suffocating stillness of watching a person fade. He gave a cup of the broth to Cora. She held it in both hands, sipping it slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. He took another cup to the wagon. "Ma'am," he said quietly from the opening, "brought you something." He had to help Cora lift her mother's head. Hannah managed a few spoonfuls before turning her head away with a soft moan. As he settled her back down, her hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Her eyes were wide, lucid, for just a moment. "Don't let him take it," she rasped, her voice urgent. "Don't let Henry find the box." Then the light in her eyes faded, and she was gone again, lost in the fever. Garrett retreated to the fire, the woman's words echoing in his mind. The box. Henry. He glanced at Cora. She was pretending to be asleep, curled up in a threadbare blanket. But he could see the tension in her small frame. She had heard her mother. She knew what she was talking about. This wasn't just a family tragedy. It was a manhunt. And he was now standing right in the middle of it. Later, after Cora had truly fallen asleep, he quietly searched the wagon. Tucked away under the driver's seat, hidden beneath a false bottom, he found it. A small, heavy lockbox made of iron. It wasn't locked. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was not a deed to a piece of land. It was a stack of official-looking bank bonds and a single folded piece of paper. He unfolded it. It was a claim, a mining claim, filed in Arizona territory for a silver lode. And the name on the claim wasn't Henry. It was Hannah McBride, and the date was only 6 months ago. The cold desert night suddenly felt a whole lot colder. This wasn't her husband's claim. It was hers. And someone named Henry was after it. Someone she was so afraid of she mistook Garrett for him. He put the claim back in the box and hid it again, his mind reeling. The broken wheel on the wagon. It wasn't from a rock. He looked closer at the splintered wood. The brakes were too clean, too sharp. It was axe work. Someone had deliberately crippled this wagon, leaving them stranded out here to die. Someone who knew about the claim, someone who wanted them out of the way, permanently. This wasn't a tragedy. It was an execution, and it wasn't over yet. He sat by the fire, his rifle across his lap, and waited for the dawn, knowing that whatever was coming for this family was now coming for him, too. The next day passed in a haze of heat and quiet dread. Hannah drifted in and out of consciousness, her mutterings growing more frantic. She spoke of shadows, of a man with cold eyes, of a promise broken. Garrett tried to piece it together. Hannah McBride. He'd heard that name, or one like it. The McBrides were a powerful, ruthless family running freight and mines out of Prescott. If Hannah was one of them, she was a long way from home, and she wasn't traveling in style. She was running. In a moment of clarity, she looked at Cora, then at Garrett. "You're a good man," she whispered, her voice so faint he barely caught it. She didn't mistake him for her husband this time. She saw him for what he was, a stranger who had stayed. "You'll look after her." It wasn't a question. It was a transfer of a sacred trust. Garrett felt the words brand him. He could only nod, his throat too tight to speak. He and Cora worked in a strange, silent partnership. He reinforced the shattered wheel as best he could, knowing it was futile. She washed her mother's face with cool water from the spring, a fragile domesticity forged in the shadow of impending loss. He watched her, this tiny, resilient creature who faced the unthinkable, with a courage he could only marvel at. She was hiding something, he knew. She was too calm, too careful. She was a survivor, just like him. The air began to change late in the afternoon. The sky to the west turned a sickly yellow-brown, a dust storm. Garrett had been caught in them before. They were blinding, choking things that could strip a man of his senses. "Get in the wagon," he told Cora, his voice urgent. "Get under the quilts. Cover your face." He secured Dust as best he could in the lee of the rock face, giving him the last of the water. He pulled the torn canvas of the wagon down, trying to secure it. The world was shrinking, the horizon vanishing behind a rolling wall of ochre dust. And that's when he saw them. 2 riders, coming in fast from the north, trying to outrun the storm. They weren't a posse. They were hard-looking men, riding with a purpose that set every nerve in Garrett's body on edge. They were headed directly for the cottonwoods, for the water, for the wagon. He ducked back behind the rocks, his heart pounding. He had a terrible feeling he knew who they were. The men reined in their horses near the spring, their faces wrapped in bandanas. One was a broad, powerfully built man with a cruel set to his mouth. The other was younger, slighter, with the same mean eyes. "There it is," the older one grunted, dismounting. Just like Jed said. Broken down right where he left them. Left them, not where they broke down, left them. Garrett's blood ran cold. This confirmed his worst fears. "What about the woman, Pa?" the younger one asked. "She's probably dead already," the man, Arthur McBride, spat. "Don't matter. It's the box I want, and the girl." Garrett slipped the thong off the hammer of his Colt. These were the vultures. They hadn't come to help. They'd come to pick the bones. McBride ripped the canvas aside and peered into the wagon. "Hannah, you in there?" He received no answer, but the rattling breath of the dying woman. He turned to his son. "Get in there. Find the lockbox. Should be under the seat." The younger man hesitated. "Pa, the storm." "Get in there, boy," Arthur roared. From inside the wagon there was a small cry of protest. "You leave her alone." It was Cora. Garrett saw Arthur McBride's face twist in anger. He strode to the back of the wagon and reached inside. A moment later he dragged Cora out, her small body struggling. "Got a mouth on you, do you?" he snarled, shaking her. "Just like your mother. Always thinking you were better than us. Where's the claim, girl? The claim to the Silver Creek lode?" He didn't say deed. He knew exactly what he was looking for. "I don't know," Cora cried, tears finally streaming down her face. "Let me go. My ma needs me." That was it. The world narrowed to that single brutal image. The years of running, of hiding, of telling himself he was no good, it all fell away. In that moment, he wasn't Garrett Weston, the outlaw. He was the man who had promised a dying woman he would look after her child. He stepped out from behind the rock. "Let the girl go," he said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the wind. McBride and his son spun around, startled. They saw a tall, dust-covered figure, a rifle held loosely in one hand. They saw the cold, flat look in his eyes, the look of a man who had nothing left to lose and had just found something worth fighting for. "Who in the hell are you?" Arthur McBride demanded, his hand moving towards his own sidearm, keeping his grip on Cora. "I'm the man telling you to let her go," Garrett said, taking a slow step forward. The wind whipped his coat around him. "This is your only warning." The younger man looked terrified, but Arthur McBride was a bully. And bullies are cowards, but they are also proud. "This ain't your business, stranger. This is family matters." "You made it my business when you laid a hand on her," Garrett replied, his eyes never leaving McBride's. "Now for the last time. Let her go." He saw the decision in McBride's eyes. The man was calculating his chances. He thought Garrett was alone. He thought he could be taken. He made his choice. He shoved Cora to the ground and drew his gun. It was a fatal mistake. McBride was fast, but he was angry and clumsy. Garrett's draw was a fluid, economical motion born of necessity. The Colt seemed to leap into his hand. His shot was a single, deafening crack, almost swallowed by the storm. Arthur McBride staggered back, a look of stunned surprise on his face. He clutched at his chest, a dark stain blossoming on his shirt, and then collapsed. The younger man stared, paralyzed with horror. He looked at his fallen father, then at Garrett, who now had the revolver leveled at his chest. He let out a strangled sob, dropped his own gun belt, and scrambled onto his horse. He spurred it mercilessly, disappearing into the blinding, swirling wall of dust. Garrett didn't watch him go. He kept his gun raised for a long moment, his ears ringing. Then he slowly lowered it. The storm was upon them in full fury. He ran to Cora, who was huddled on the ground, shaking. He scooped her into his arms and carried her to the shelter of the rocks by the spring. He held her tight, shielding her with his own body as the world dissolved into a maelstrom of wind and sand. He could feel her quiet, frightened sobs. He said nothing. He just held her. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a strange, muffled silence and a world remade in shades of brown. Garrett gently set Cora on her feet. "Stay here," he said. He walked over to the body of Arthur McBride, a still shape half buried in new-fallen dust. He felt nothing. No triumph, no remorse. He left him for the desert to claim. Then he went to the wagon. He knew before he looked inside. The silence was too complete. The ragged sound of Hannah's breathing was gone. He pushed aside the canvas. In the dim, dusty light, she lay peacefully, as if asleep. The lines of pain were gone from her face. She looked young again. He stood there for a long time, hat in his hand. Cora came up behind him, her small hand finding his. She looked past him into the wagon. She made no sound. No more tears. It was as if her well of grief was too deep to spill over. That evening, Garrett dug a grave beneath the cottonwoods. He wrapped Hannah's body in the cleanest quilt he could find. He and Cora stood beside the simple mound of earth as twilight bruised the sky. Cora looked up at him, her face pale. Her eyes were full of a question she didn't need to ask. The prayer. Garrett swallowed hard. He felt like a fraud, but he had made a promise. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he began, his voice rough. "Hannah, I don't know the right words. I'm not a praying man, but your daughter, Cora, she's safe. I promise you that. I'll look after her. I'll get her to that ocean you told her about. I swear it." He paused. "May you find your peace. Amen." It was a poor prayer, clumsy and broken, but it was all he had. It was the truest thing he had said in years. He felt Cora's hand tighten on his. They left the next morning. Garrett salvaged what he could from the wagon, the lockbox, a few of Hannah's belongings, and a small, worn book of stories. He lifted Cora onto Dust's saddle in front of him, and they rode west, away from the broken wagon and the fresh grave. Garrett Weston was still an outlaw with a price on his head, but something had changed. He was no longer just running from something, he was riding towards something, a purpose, a promise. As they crested a rise, the great empty expanse of the desert stretching before them, Cora finally spoke. "Mr. Garrett?" "Yeah, Cora. They'll come looking for us, won't they?" she asked, her voice steady. "The other one. He'll tell them." Garrett looked down at her small, determined face. She wasn't asking for reassurance. She was stating a fact. "Yeah, kid," he said. "They will." "The box," she continued. "The claim. It wasn't my pa's. It was my ma's. She found it. Pa wanted to sell it to them, to Uncle Arthur. Ma wouldn't. So Pa left." Garrett's grip on the reins tightened. So Henry wasn't dead. He was a coward who'd sold out his own family. "And Jed?" Garrett asked, remembering the name Arthur had said. "Who's Jed?" Cora was silent for a long moment. "Jed's the sheriff in Mineral Creek," she said quietly. "He's their cousin." A cold dread washed over Garrett. A corrupt sheriff. This wasn't just a family squabble over a mine. It was a conspiracy. The McBrides, with the law on their side, had tried to steal Hannah's claim, first by coercion, then by murder. They had sent Sheriff Jed to disable the wagon, leaving them to die in the desert, where no one would ask questions. It was a perfect, silent crime. Except for one thing they hadn't counted on: him. And now they had a witness who had escaped, a son who would ride straight to Mineral Creek and tell Sheriff Jed not only that his father was dead, but that the girl was still alive, and she was with a man who had just killed Arthur McBride. They weren't just being hunted for a silver claim anymore. Now they were being hunted for murder. The price on Garrett's head was about to get a whole lot higher. They rode hard for 2 days, pushing west, away from Mineral Creek. The desert was a relentless furnace, but the fear of what was behind them was a sharper spur than any heat. Garrett rationed their water, his own thirst a constant burning reminder of their precarious state. Cora was quiet, a small, stoic passenger who never complained. She watched the horizon with the same intensity as he did, her old eyes scanning for dust clouds, for any sign of pursuit. On the third night, as they made a cold camp in a rocky wash, she pulled the book of stories from their meager pack. "Ma used to read to me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She opened the book, and something fell out. It wasn't a bookmark. It was a photograph, faded and creased, a man and a woman standing stiffly for the camera. The woman was a younger, happier Hannah. The man was lean, with a weak chin and shifty eyes. "Is that him?" Garrett asked. "Henry?" Cora nodded. "He said he was going to make us rich. He said the McBrides would make us partners." Garrett stared at the man's face. There was no strength in it, only greed. He'd sold his wife and child for a promise of wealth. But then Garrett saw something else. Tucked into the corner of the photograph, barely visible, was another man standing in the background, half hidden in shadow. A man with a familiar, cruel face. It was Arthur McBride, but he was wearing a deputy's badge. This conspiracy went deeper than he thought. Arthur wasn't just a powerful local figure. He was the law, or at least he represented it. He and Sheriff Jed weren't just cousins. They were partners in crime. They controlled the whole region. There would be no one to turn to, no one to trust. They were utterly, completely alone. He tucked the photo back into the book. "Cora," he said, his voice low. "The claim. Why is it so important? It's just a piece of paper." She looked up at him, her expression serious. "It's not just silver, Mr. Garrett. Ma said it was more than that. She said there was something else in the rock. Something. Shiny. Yellow. Gold." The McBride claim was for silver. But Hannah had found gold. A strike that would be worth 100 times more. A strike the McBrides were willing to kill their own family for. And now he understood the desperation, the sheer ruthlessness of it all. They weren't just trying to steal a silver mine. They were trying to steal a fortune. And Cora was the only living person besides them who knew the secret. The next day, they saw the dust cloud. A single rider coming up fast from the east. It wasn't a posse. It was one man, moving with a relentless, steady pace. A tracker. Garrett pulled dust behind a rock formation, his heart pounding. They couldn't outrun him, not with the girl. He had to make a stand. He pulled his rifle from its scabbard, his hands steady. He had killed one man to protect this child. He would kill another. He watched as the rider grew closer. The man was lean, dressed in black, riding a powerful bay horse. He didn't look like a lawman. He looked like something else, something older and more dangerous. A bounty hunter. Garrett had seen his kind before. They never gave up. They never stopped. And they always got their man. As the rider came closer, Garrett raised his rifle, sighting down the barrel. But then the man did something unexpected. He reined in his horse 100 yards out, in the open. He raised a hand, palm open. A sign of parley. Garrett hesitated. It could be a trick, but his gut told him otherwise. "Stay here," he whispered to Cora, his eyes never leaving the figure in the distance. "Don't make a sound." He walked out from behind the rocks, his rifle held ready. "That's far enough," Garrett called out, his voice carrying in the still air. The man dismounted slowly. "Garrett Weston," the man said, his voice calm and level. "My name is Silas. I've been tracking you for 2 months." Garrett's blood ran cold. This wasn't about the McBrides. This was about him, about the price on his own head. "I'm not looking for a fight, Weston," Silas continued. "Just came to deliver a message." "I'm not interested in your messages," Garrett said, his finger tightening on the trigger. "This one you'll want to hear," Silas said. "It's from Jed McBride. He knows you have the girl. He knows you have the claim. He's not putting a bounty on you for murder. He's putting out a bounty for kidnapping. Says you've taken his niece. He's offering $5,000 for the safe return of the girl, and a bullet for you." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Kidnapping. It was a clever, vicious move. Now every fortune seeker, every desperate man in the territory would be looking for them. They wouldn't be trying to bring him in for trial. They'd be trying to rescue the kidnapped girl. They would shoot him on sight without a second thought. Jed McBride had just painted a target on his back a mile wide. "Why are you telling me this?" Garrett asked, his mind racing. "You could have just shot me in the back and taken the girl yourself." Silas gave a humorless smile. "Couple of reasons. First, I don't work for men like Jed McBride. Second, the bounty on you for that bank job in Texas is $10,000. Jed's trying to lowball me, and I don't like being lowballed." He paused, his eyes flicking towards the rocks where Cora was hiding. "And third, I knew your brother." Garrett flinched as if struck. His brother, Liam, dead 10 years now. "How did you know Liam?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We rode together," Silas said, "before he settled down. Before everything. He was a good man, Weston. He told me about you. Told me you weren't a killer. Just a man who made one bad mistake." Silas looked him straight in the eye. "Jed's got the whole town of Mineral Creek locked down. He's sent riders to every outpost and settlement within 200 miles. There's no way you can get through. Not with the girl." "So what do you want?" Garrett demanded. "I want my $10,000, Silas said calmly. "And I'm guessing you want to keep that girl alive. Seems to me we have a common enemy. The McBrides have a stronghold up in the Dragoon Mountains. It's where they process their ore. It's a fortress. But it's also where they keep their secrets, the real ledgers, proof of everything they've done." Silas mounted his horse. "I'm heading north around their patrols. If you're smart, you'll head for the mountains, not Mineral Creek. It's your only chance. If you make it, I'll find you." He turned his horse to leave. "Silas," Garrett called out. "Why?" Silas looked back over his shoulder. "Liam saved my life once. Consider this me repaying a debt." He spurred his horse and rode off, disappearing into the heat haze. Garrett stood there for a long moment, the desert sun beating down on him. The world had just turned upside down again. A bounty hunter who wouldn't bring him in. A way out that led directly into the heart of his enemy's territory. A dead brother's ghost offering a hand from beyond the grave. He looked back at Cora, who was peeking out from behind the rocks. Her small face was filled with worry. He had made a promise to a dying woman. Now, to keep it, he had to trust the one man who had every reason to kill him. They turned north, towards the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, shimmering in the distance. It was a fool's errand, walking into the lion's den, but Silas was right. It was the only direction they wouldn't be expected to go. Every lawman, every bounty hunter, would be watching the roads west to California. The mountains were their only hope. The journey was brutal. The land grew harsher, the water scarcer. Garrett pushed them relentlessly, his fear a cold knot in his stomach. He saw the ghosts of riders in the shimmering heat, heard the phantom cry of a posse on the wind. He was jumpy, on edge, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. Was Silas telling the truth? Or was he walking Garrett and the girl into a trap, a place where the McBrides could finish their business cleanly, with no witnesses? Cora seemed to sense his turmoil. She was quiet, but her presence was a constant, grounding force. One evening, as he cleaned his revolver by the fire, she spoke. "You knew my ma was sick for a long time, didn't you?" Garrett looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" "Back at the wagon," she said. "She wasn't just sick from the fever. She was sick before that. Pa, Henry. He brought some men to the cabin one night. Uncle Arthur was one of them. They were yelling. Ma told them to get out. After they left, she started coughing. a different kind of cough. And she got tired all the time. Garrett stopped cleaning his gun. "What are you saying, Cora?" "There was a bottle," she said, her voice small, "in Henry's saddlebag. He'd put drops from it in her water jug sometimes. He told me it was her medicine." A horrifying realization dawned on Garrett. Hannah wasn't dying of consumption. She was being poisoned. Slowly, methodically. Henry hadn't just abandoned his family. He had actively tried to murder his wife to make her death look natural, so he and the McBrides could take the claim without any fuss. The shattered wagon wheel wasn't the start of the murder plot. It was just the final, brutal act. The thought filled him with a rage so cold and pure it felt like ice in his veins. He had spent his life running from the one man he'd killed, a killing he'd regretted every single day. But now, he found himself wanting to hunt a man down. He wanted to find Henry. He wanted to make him pay. 2 days later, they reached the foothills of the mountains. The landscape changed from open desert to a labyrinth of canyons and pine-choked ravines. It was good country to hide in, but also good country for an ambush. They found a cave hidden behind a waterfall, a perfect place to rest and regroup. As Garrett scouted the area, Cora explored the back of the cave. "Mr. Garrett!" she called out, her voice echoing. "Come look!" He hurried back to find her standing in a small, dry chamber at the rear of the cave. Stacked against the wall were several rotting wooden crates. But it wasn't the crates that held his attention. It was the markings stenciled on their sides, U.S. Army, and a date from nearly 20 years ago. This was an old Army cache. He pried one open with his knife. It was filled with repeating rifles, still packed in Cosmoline, and boxes of ammunition. Another crate held dynamite. It was a treasure trove, an arsenal left over from the Apache Wars, and it was a game changer. He was no longer just a man with a single rifle and a revolver. He now had the means to fight a small war. But as he looked at the crates, he saw something else. A name carved into the rock wall of the cave. L. Weston, Liam, his brother. Garrett sank to his knees, his breath catching in his throat. Of all the caves in all the mountains, he had stumbled into his brother's old hideout. Liam had ridden with the Army Scouts for a time. This must have been a place he knew, a place he supplied. Silas hadn't just sent him towards the mountains. He had sent him to a specific place, a place he must have learned about from Liam. It was a test of trust, and a gift. Armed with new weapons and a renewed sense of purpose, they pressed on, deeper into the mountains. Using a crude map Liam had etched into the cave wall, Garrett navigated the treacherous terrain, moving closer to the McBride stronghold. The air grew thin and cold. They were in the heart of enemy territory now. One afternoon, while hiding in a thicket overlooking a trail, they saw a patrol. 3 riders armed to the teeth, wearing the familiar deputy badges of Mineral Creek. They weren't just searching, they were hunting, and they had someone with them. A native tracker, his eyes fixed on the ground. They were on their trail. There was no more running. The fight was coming to them. That night, Garrett prepared his ambush. He chose a narrow pass, a place where the trail was hemmed in by steep rock walls. He placed the dynamite, carefully concealing the charges. He gave Cora a rifle, showed her how to use it, and positioned her high up on a ledge, a place where she would be safe and could act as a lookout. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also a grim determination. This child had been forged in fire. She would not break. He took his own position and waited. Hours passed. The moon rose, casting long, eerie shadows across the canyon. Just after midnight, he heard the sound of approaching horses. It was the patrol. They were riding slowly, cautiously, the tracker leading the way on foot. They were almost at the spot. Garrett took a deep breath, his heart pounding a steady, heavy rhythm. He waited until they were in the kill zone. Then he pushed the plunger. The explosion was deafening. Rock and earth erupted, sending horses and men tumbling in a chaotic spray. Two of the riders were down, crushed by the rockslide. But the third, the leader and the tracker, had been just outside the main blast. They scrambled for cover, firing blindly into the darkness. Garrett returned fire with the repeating rifle, the shots echoing like thunder. He was no longer one man against an army. He was a force, a ghost from his brother's past, armed with army dynamite, fighting in the shadows. The remaining deputy screamed in terror as Garrett's bullets peppered the rocks around him. He broke cover and ran, only to be cut down in a hail of gunfire. The canyon fell silent. The only sound was the ringing in Garrett's ears and the soft whimper of an injured horse. The tracker was gone, vanished into the night. Garrett knew he would go back for reinforcements. Time was running out. He climbed up to Cora's perch. She was holding the rifle, her knuckles white, but her eyes were clear. "You did it," she whispered. "We did it," he corrected her. He looked down at the carnage below. This was the life he had tried to escape, the violence he had sworn off. But this time, it felt different. It wasn't a desperate act of self-preservation. It was justice. He gathered what ammunition and supplies he could from the dead men. On the leader, he found a map. It showed the layout of the McBride mine and stronghold, and it showed something else. A second, smaller camp, marked with a single H. Henry. He was here. He was close. Garrett's rage returned, cold and sharp. He would finish this, not just for Cora, not just for Hannah, but for himself, to silence the ghosts of his own past by delivering a righteous end to a man who deserved it. The map showed Henry's camp was just a few miles from the main stronghold, in an isolated canyon. It was a strange place to be, away from the main operation. Garrett and Cora approached cautiously, moving through the trees like ghosts. They smelled the camp before they saw it. Wood smoke and coffee. Peering through the pines, Garrett saw a single tent and a campfire, and a man, his back to them, staring into the flames. Henry. Garrett's hand went to his Colt. It would be so easy, a single shot, an eye for an eye. But that wasn't justice. That was murder, the same crime he'd been running from for years. He looked at Cora. Her face was a mask of stone. "Stay here," he whispered. "This is my job." He stepped out of the trees, his rifle leveled. "Henry," he said. The man spun around, his eyes wide with fear. It was the man from the photograph. He looked pathetic, a shell of a man hollowed out by greed and cowardice. "Who are you?" he stammered, scrambling for a pistol lying on a nearby crate. "Don't," Garrett said, his voice flat. "I'm the man who buried your wife." Henry froze, his face turning pale. "She's dead?" "You know she is," Garrett said. "You've been killing her for months." Henry started to babble, making excuses. He said the McBrides forced him, that they threatened him. He said he never meant for her to die. Garrett listened, his rage growing with every lie. "Where is it?" Henry finally blurted out. "The claim. Did you get it? We can be partners. 50-50. And in that moment, Garrett understood. This wasn't a prison camp. It was a hideout. Henry wasn't a prisoner of the McBrides. He was waiting for them to kill his wife and daughter so he could step in and claim his reward. But before Garrett could act, a new voice cut through the air. "Drop it, Weston." Garrett turned his head slightly. Stepping out of the shadows was the younger McBride, the one who had fled the dust storm, and with him were 4 more men, all armed. Behind them, the Apache tracker stood silently, his dark eyes fixed on Garrett. It was a trap. The tracker hadn't gone for reinforcements. He'd circled around and led them right here. "I knew you'd come for him," the young McBride sneered. "Knew you had some kind of hero complex. My cousin Jed sends his regards." Henry scrambled over to the McBrides, a look of relief on his face. "You see, I told you he'd come. I did my part." The young McBride just laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. "You did, Henry. You surely did." And then, without a moment's hesitation, he raised his pistol and shot Henry square in the chest. Henry collapsed, a look of utter shock on his face, his blood staining the dirt. "Loose ends," McBride said with a shrug, turning his gun back to Garrett. "Now give me the box, and the girl." From the tree line, a single shot rang out, not from a rifle, a pistol. Young McBride's eyes went wide, and he staggered back, a red hole appearing in his throat. He gurgled, clutching at his neck, and fell. Everyone froze, looking around in confusion. And then a figure stepped out of the darkness. Silas, the bounty hunter. "I believe I'm owed $10,000, Silas said calmly, his smoking pistol held steady. "And the McBrides ain't paying." The remaining men were stunned, but only for a second. The canyon erupted in a cacophony of gunfire. Garrett dove for cover, firing the repeating rifle. Silas was a whirlwind of motion, his two pistols barking, dropping another man before he hit the ground. Garrett took down a third. The last man, seeing he was outgunned, threw down his rifle and ran, screaming into the night. The silence that followed was deafening. Silas walked over to the young McBride's body and calmly reloaded his pistols. "Told you I don't like being lowballed," he said, not even looking at Garrett. "The tracker?" Garrett asked. Silas jerked his head towards the trees. "Paid him more than Jed was. He's a practical man." Garrett looked over at Cora, who was now emerging from the trees, her face pale but resolute. She walked over to Henry's body and looked down at him, her expression unreadable. Then she spat on the ground beside him and turned away. The cycle of betrayal was finally over. "It's not finished," Silas said, interrupting the moment. "Jed's still at the stronghold, and he'll have a dozen men with him. They heard the shots. They'll be coming." "Then we don't wait for them," Garrett said. He looked at Silas, then at Cora, an outlaw, a bounty hunter, and a little girl. It was a strange army. "We take the fight to them." The McBride stronghold was built into the side of the mountain, a sprawling complex of mine heads, processing sheds, and bunkhouses. It was a fortress, just as Silas had said. But Garrett had a plan, a desperate, crazy plan. Using the dynamite, they created a diversion, blowing a secondary tunnel entrance on the far side of the complex. As half of Jed's men rushed to investigate, Garrett and Silas slipped in through the main gate, using the chaos as cover. Cora, hidden safely on a ridge with a rifle, was their eyes, their lookout. They moved through the shadows of the camp, silent and deadly. They were no longer just men. They were instruments of vengeance. They found Jed McBride in the assayer's office, frantically trying to load saddlebags with gold bullion. He was a big man, running to fat, with a sheriff's badge pinned crookedly to his vest. He looked up, his face a mask of sweat and fear as Garrett and Silas stepped into the room. "It's over, Jed," Garrett said. Jed's eyes darted between them, looking for an escape. He saw none. "Weston," he snarled, "you have no idea who you're messing with. I have friends in Prescott, in Tucson. You'll never get away with this." "I'm not the one who needs to get away," Garrett said. "You murdered your own family for this rock. You left a woman and a child to die in the desert." "She was weak," Jed roared. "Her and her bleeding heart. That claim belonged to the family." "It belonged to her," Garrett said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And now it belongs to her daughter." Jed lunged for a shotgun propped against his desk. He was fast for a big man, but Silas was faster. A single shot from his pistol, and Jed McBride fell back against the wall, sliding to the floor, leaving a smear of red on the wood. He was dead before he stopped moving. They found the ledgers in a safe behind his desk, the real ledgers. Years of extortion, theft, and murder, all meticulously documented. It was enough to bring down the entire McBride empire and all of their powerful friends. They gathered the books and the gold that rightfully belonged to Cora and walked out of the office. The remaining McBride men, seeing their leader was dead, and that the fight was lost, threw down their guns. The reign of the McBrides was over. As the sun rose, casting a golden light over the mountains, they rode away from the stronghold, leaving the smoldering ruins behind them. They met Cora at the bottom of the trail. She looked at the saddlebags filled with gold, then at the ledgers. She didn't smile. She just nodded, a solemn acceptance of her inheritance and the terrible price that had been paid for it. They rode to Prescott, the territorial capital. Silas, using his contacts, delivered the ledgers directly to a federal marshal he trusted. The story of the McBride conspiracy became the stuff of legend. With the evidence from the ledgers and Silas's testimony, Garrett Weston was cleared of the Texas bank robbery charge. It turned out he'd been framed by a man connected to the McBrides. The kidnapping charge evaporated. He was a free man. Silas collected his $10,000 bounty, shook Garrett's hand, and rode off into the sunset, a man who had finally settled his brother's debt. Garrett and Cora stood on the dusty street, watching him go. "So what now, Mr. Garrett?" Cora asked. Garrett looked down at her. He had a choice. He could ride away, start a new life. He was free. But he had one last promise to keep. "I hear the ocean is pretty this time of year," he said. A small, genuine smile finally broke across Cora's face. The journey to the coast took another month. They traded the desert dust for green hills, and finally for the scent of salt on the air. One afternoon, they crested a final hill, and there it was. The ocean. It was bigger than the sky, just as Hannah had said. A vast, endless expanse of shimmering blue, singing its eternal song. Cora stood on the cliff's edge, her hair blowing in the sea breeze, her eyes wide with a wonder that erased all the horror she had seen. She looked so small against the immense backdrop of the sea. Garrett stood beside her, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in over a decade. He was no longer an outlaw, no longer a ghost running from his past. He was just a man who had kept his promise. "Is it pretty, Mr. Garrett?" Cora asked, her voice filled with awe. He looked at the endless horizon, at the small, determined girl beside him who had saved him as much as he had saved her. "Yeah, kid," he said, a warmth spreading through his chest. "It's pretty." They had made it. They were finally home. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of justice from the dark corners of the world, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. You never know what secrets are buried just waiting to be uncovered.